The sauna door creaked as I closed it behind me, the thick, balmy air hitting me like a wave. The world outside felt miles away, muted by the embrace of this small, steamy room. My skin, already damp from the day, welcomed the heat as I settled onto the wooden bench. It was my escape, my sanctuary, the only place where the weight of the world couldn't reach me. I leaned back, closing my eyes, and let the familiar hiss of water on hot stones fill my ears. The scent of cedarwood mixed with the faint tang of my sweat. It was soothing, intoxicating even, as if the sauna had the power to strip away not just the grime of the day but the layers of stress, regret, and doubt that had been building up for years. Just as my mind began to drift, I heard the faint shuffle of footsteps. The door opened again, releasing a puff of heat into the cooler air outside. I didn't need to open my eyes to know who it was. "Didn't expect to see you here tonight," I said, my voice calm, almost teasing. Mikhail stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "Thought I'd give it a try," he replied. His voice was steady, but I could sense the hesitation in it. He was nervous. He sat down across from me, his towel tightly wrapped around his waist, his damp hair sticking to his forehead. He was a young man now, no longer the gangly teenager I remembered. There was a quiet confidence about him these days, but tonight, that confidence seemed tempered by something else. We sat in silence for a while, the only sound the rhythmic hiss of water on the stones. I kept my eyes closed, letting the heat work its way into my muscles. But I could feel his gaze flickering toward me, just as I could feel the rising tension in the room. It wasn't the first time we'd been alone together, but something about this moment felt different. "Hotter than you thought it'd be?" I asked, breaking the silence. He chuckled softly. "Yeah. Takes some getting used to." I opened my eyes, meeting his for the first time that evening. He looked away quickly, pretending to adjust the towel around his waist. A smile tugged at the corner of my lips. There was something endearing about his awkwardness, a reminder of the boy he used to be. "You've been quiet today," I said, my tone light but probing. He shrugged, running a hand through his damp hair. "Just a lot on my mind. Care to share?" He hesitated, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of his towel. "Nothing important," he said finally. I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on my knees. The movement was casual, but I noticed the way his eyes flickered toward me, just for a second, before darting away again. "You know," I said, "this is supposed to be a place for relaxation. A place where you can let go of all that stuff in your head." He nodded, but his expression didn't change. If anything, he looked even more uncomfortable. The silence stretched between us, thick as the steam that filled the room. I leaned back again, closing my eyes. "You can talk to me, Mikhail," I said softly. "You always could." He didn't respond right away. I could hear him shifting on the bench, the wood creaking under his weight. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Do you ever feel like you're carrying too much? Like, you don't know how to put it down?" I opened my eyes, surprised by the vulnerability in his tone. "All the time," I admitted. "But you learn to carry it differently. Or you find someone to help you with the weight." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a moment, the tension in the room shifted. It wasn't just the steam or the heat, it was something deeper, something unspoken. I don't know who to talk to," he said. "You're talking to me now," I pointed out. He smiled, a faint, almost shy smile that reminded me of the boy he used to be. "Yeah," he said. "I guess I am." For a while, we sat there in silence again, the heat wrapping around us like a cocoon. The tension was still there, but it felt different now, softer, less charged. I closed my eyes, letting myself relax into the moment. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing. That we were standing on the edge of something we couldn't quite see, something we couldn't yet name. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to step back, or step forward. The room felt heavier as the silence stretched between us. The steam swirled lazily, softening the edges of the world, wrapping us in its dense warmth. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something unsaid hanging in the air, like the weight of a storm cloud just waiting to break. Mikhail sat across from me, his posture tense, his fingers restlessly fidgeting with the towel wrapped around his waist. He was here, but his mind seemed miles away. "You've grown quiet again," I said, trying to sound lighthearted. My voice echoed softly against the wooden walls, the sound oddly intimate in the confined space. He looked up at me, startled, like a deer caught in headlights. "Just thinking," he murmured. About. He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. Life. The usual. I leaned back against the warm wooden slats, letting the heat seep into my back. Life can be a heavy thing, I said after a moment. But you don't have to carry it all by yourself, you know. He glanced up at me, his expression unreadable. For a moment, it looked like he might say something, but then he shook his head and looked away again. The tension in his shoulders was palpable, and I found myself wanting to reach out, to do something to ease whatever burden he was carrying. But I held back, unsure if he would welcome the gesture or push me away. You can talk to me, I said, my tone softer now. You always could. He let out a short, humorless laugh. Could I, though? His words caught me off guard. What do you mean? I asked, sitting up a little straighter. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees and running a hand through his damp hair. It's just complicated, he said finally. There are things I want to say, but I don't know how. I watched him carefully, trying to read the emotions playing across his face. There was frustration there, and something else, a vulnerability that he was trying hard to hide. Sometimes, I said gently, the hardest things to say are the ones we need to say the most. He looked up at me then, his eyes meeting mine. For a moment, it felt like the rest of the world had fallen away, leaving just the two of us in this small, steamy room. You make it sound so easy, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. It's not, I admitted. But that doesn't mean it's not worth trying. He held my gaze for a long moment before finally looking away. The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating. I could feel the weight of his unspoken words pressing down on both of us, and it took everything in me not to break it. I wanted to give him the space he needed, but I also wanted to reach out, to bridge the gap that seemed to be growing between us with each passing second. It's just, I feel stuck, he said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence like a crack of thunder. Like I'm trapped in this, in-between place, and I don't know how to get out. I leaned forward slightly, my heart aching at the rawness in his voice. What do you mean? I asked. He shook his head, his jaw tightening. I don't know. It's like, I'm not a kid anymore, but I don't feel like an adult either. Everyone expects me to have it all figured out, but I don't. I feel like I'm just drifting. His words hit me harder than I expected. I knew that feeling all too well, the sense of being lost, untethered, unsure of where you belong. That's normal, I said softly. No one has it all figured out, no matter how much they might pretend otherwise. And it's okay to feel lost. It just means you're human. He let out a shaky breath, and for the first time that evening, I saw the tension in his shoulders ease ever so slightly. It doesn't feel okay, he said. It feels lonely. My chest tightened at his words. You're not alone, Mikhail, I said firmly. You have people who care about you. Who want to help you, if you'll let them. He looked up at me again, his eyes searching mine as if he was trying to decide whether or not to believe me. Do I? He asked quietly. Yes, I said, my voice steady. You do. For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then, slowly, he nodded. Thanks, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I gave him a small smile, hoping it would reassure him. Anytime. The silence that followed was different this time, softer, less oppressive. It felt like we had crossed some invisible threshold, like the weight that had been pressing down on us had shifted just enough to make it bearable. The steam continued to swirl around us, the hiss of the water on the stones filling the space between our words. And for the first time that evening, I felt like we might be okay. The steam hung heavy in the room as we sat in silence again. Mikhail leaned back, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on a point just past my shoulder. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the way he wrestled with something unspoken. The warmth of the sauna felt stifling now, but I didn't move. I wasn't sure if I was waiting for him to speak or bracing myself for whatever he might say. It's strange, he said finally, his voice low. How things can change so quickly. I tilted my head, watching him. What do you mean? He hesitated, his jaw tightening as though he was debating whether or not to answer. You ever feel like you're not the same person you were a year ago? Like you've changed, but you're not sure if it's for the better. I nodded slowly. All the time. Change is hard, especially when you're still figuring out who you are. He let out a soft laugh, but there was no humor in it. Yeah. It's like I keep trying to move forward, but I feel stuck in the past. And sometimes I feel like I don't even recognize myself anymore. His words hit me harder than I expected, stirring something deep within me. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, and met his gaze. "Mikhail," I said softly, "you're allowed to change. And you're allowed to take your time figuring out who you want to be." He looked at me, his expression unreadable, and for a moment, I thought he might say something. But then he stood abruptly, his movements quick and sharp. "I need some air," he muttered. Before I could respond, he pushed open the sauna door and stepped outside, leaving a gust of cool air in his wake. I sat there for a moment, the sudden emptiness of the room pressing down on me. Then, almost without thinking, I got up and followed him. The night air was crisp and cool, a stark contrast to the heat of the sauna. Mikhail was standing at the edge of the patio, his back to me, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The moonlight cast a pale glow over him, highlighting the tension in his posture. "Mikhail," I said, my voice soft. "Talk to me." He didn't turn around. "I don't know if I can." "Yes, you can," I said, taking a step closer. "Whatever it is, you can tell me." He turned then, his eyes meeting mine, and I saw the raw emotion in his expression. "It's just, everything feels so messed up. I don't know how to fix it." "You don't have to fix it alone," I said. "I'm here." For a moment, he just looked at me, his chest rising and falling with each heavy breath. And then, to my surprise, he smiled, a small, hesitant smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Thanks," he said quietly. "I mean it." I smiled back, a wave of relief washing over me. "Anytime." As we stood there, the tension that had been weighing us down seemed to lift, if only slightly. The cool night air wrapped around us, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a flicker of hope. Whatever we were facing, I knew we'd find a way through it. But just as I thought the moment was over, Mikhail spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you ever wonder if some things are better left unsaid?" I frowned, unsure of what he meant. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the ground. "Nothing. Forget I said anything." Before I could press him further, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the garden. I stood there for a moment, the cool air biting at my skin, and felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, confusion, and something else I couldn't quite name. And then it hit me. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed.